What if the person who knew the truth the longest was the one who stayed silent the most? What if the warnings were there? Not in police files, not in court records, but in whispered jokes, in half-serious late-night conversations, in dreams that came back again and again until they stopped being dreams. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And what if the man who carried that knowledge finally broke his silence and said 4 words that changed everything? "I'm sorry, I lied." That's how this story begins. Not with blood, not with sirens, not with headlines, but with guilt. Because in this dramatized story, the truth doesn't arrive loudly. It seeps out, slowly, reluctantly, from the one person who swore he would never tell it. For decades, he was known as the funny one, the safe one, the loyal one, the friend who made everyone laugh when things got uncomfortable. But behind the jokes, behind the public smiles, behind the award show anecdotes, there was something else entirely. Fear. A fear shared in confidence. A fear laughed off in public. A fear buried so deep that even the man who heard it convinced himself it couldn't be real. Until it was. Ask yourself this. How many times can someone warn you before it stops being a warning and becomes a confession? In this dramatized account, the filmmaker at the center of the story wasn't afraid of strangers. He wasn't afraid of Hollywood. He wasn't afraid of failure. He was afraid of someone close. Too close. So close that admitting the fear out loud felt unthinkable. And the person he trusted enough to say it to? His best friend. The one person who knew him before the fame, before the money, before the carefully managed public image. They used to sit together late at night, long after the cameras stopped rolling, talking about everything and nothing. Careers, family, regrets, old jokes that never got old. And sometimes, when the room went quiet, the conversation would change. Not directly, never directly. It would come out sideways, through humor, through exaggeration, through stories that ended with laughter just a little too forced. Have you ever noticed how people sometimes tell the truth while pretending they're joking? In this story, that's exactly how it started. A comment here, a passing remark there. "He's intense, you know. I don't always sleep well when he's around. Crazy dream last night." Don't even want to say it out loud. Each time, brushed off. Each time, minimized. Because acknowledging it would mean admitting something no one wanted to admit. That sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from outside your life. It comes from within it. From someone who knows your routines, your habits, your vulnerabilities. From someone who knows exactly where the doors are locked and where they're not. But back then, it was easier to laugh. It was easier to believe that stress was talking, that imagination was running wild, that creative minds sometimes spiral. After all, this was Hollywood. Eccentricity was normal. Dramatic language was part of the culture. And so the warnings were filed away as nothing more than that. Warnings. Until one night, the dreams stopped being jokes. In this dramatized narrative, the filmmaker described them in detail. Not once, not twice, multiple times. The same dream. Over and over. The same ending. Always the same ending. He would wake up shaken, heart racing, certain that what he saw while sleeping felt too real to ignore. But even then, he hesitated. Because how do you say something like that out loud? How do you admit that the person you're supposed to protect is the person you fear? And how do you tell the world that the warning signs were there, long before anyone was willing to look at them? The best friend listened, and did nothing. Not because he didn't care, not because he didn't believe him, but because believing it would have meant acting on it. And acting on it would have shattered lives long before anything else did. So he promised something instead. A promise that would haunt him later. "I won't tell anyone." At the time, it felt like loyalty. It felt like protecting a friend from his own thoughts. Protecting a family from rumors. Protecting a legacy from speculation. Have you ever made a promise that felt right in the moment and devastating in hindsight? That's the core of this story. Not violence. Not crime. But silence. Because silence has consequences too. Years passed. Public appearances continued. Jokes were told. Smiles were exchanged. On the outside, nothing seemed wrong. But behind closed doors, tension grew. Small things turned into big arguments. Big arguments turned into long silences. And the dreams? They didn't stop. They just stopped being shared. Which raises a disturbing question. What happens when someone stops talking about their fears? Do they disappear? Or do they harden into something else? In this dramatized account, the best friend would later admit that the last conversation still echoes in his mind. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. A look held a second too long. A goodbye that felt heavier than usual. A joke that didn't land. And then nothing. Until everything changed. The news didn't come gently. It came like a punch. A call. A headline. A confirmation that no one wanted to hear. And in that moment, the promise that once felt noble began to feel unbearable. Because suddenly, the jokes weren't jokes anymore. The dreams weren't imagination. And the silence wasn't protection. It was complicity. That's when the words started to form. I'm sorry. I lied. I should have said something. But saying it now wouldn't bring anyone back. It would only raise questions no one was prepared to answer. Questions like, who else knew? Who else noticed the signs? Who else chose comfort over confrontation? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, if the truth had been told earlier, would the ending have been different? Or was it always inevitable? That's what this story is really about. Not just what happened, but what didn't. The conversations that stopped short. The warnings that were laughed away. The loyalty that crossed the line into silence. And the friend who now has to live with the knowledge that the truth he buried might have mattered more than the promise he kept. Because as this dramatized story unfolds, one thing becomes clear. The confession wasn't the beginning. It was the aftermath. And what comes next forces us to confront something uncomfortable. Sometimes, the most dangerous lies aren't the ones we tell others. They're the ones we tell ourselves. And just when you think this was the worst thing he kept secret, another memory surfaces. One he never shared with anyone. Until now. But what that memory reveals changes the entire story. And once you hear it, you'll never look at the silence the same way again. The confession didn't happen on a stage. It didn't happen under bright lights or in front of microphones. It happened in a quiet room, late at night, when there was no audience left to entertain and no laughter left to hide behind. Have you ever noticed how the truth always waits until you're alone? In this dramatized story, the best friend sat by himself for a long time before saying anything at all. The room was familiar. Too familiar. Photos on the walls. Awards on shelves. Evidence of a life lived loudly and successfully. But the silence in that room felt heavier than any applause he'd ever received. Because this wasn't about career highlights or funny stories anymore. This was about something he had carried for years. Something he had pushed down every time it tried to surface. Something he convinced himself didn't matter. Until it did. He would later say the guilt didn't arrive all at once. It crept in, slowly, first as discomfort, then as regret, then as something that started waking him up in the middle of the night. Do you know that feeling when your mind replays old conversations and suddenly changes the tone? A sentence that once felt harmless suddenly sounds like a warning. A laugh that once felt natural now sounds forced. That's what started happening. He remembered the first time the fear was mentioned. Not dramatically, not emotionally, almost casually. They were sitting together after a long day. The kind of day where everyone is tired, filters are down, and honesty sneaks out when you're not watching for it. The filmmaker had leaned back and sighed. I know this sounds crazy, he said. And right there, the best friend should have paid attention. Because when someone starts a sentence like that, they're usually telling you the truth they're afraid to admit. But instead of pressing, he smiled, joked, deflected, because that's what he always did. That's Hollywood, he laughed. We're all a little crazy. The filmmaker smiled back. But something in his eyes didn't. Have you ever seen someone smile while their fear stayed behind? That was the first crack. After that, the comments came more often. Always wrapped in humor. Always disguised as exaggeration. He gets intense sometimes. I lock the doors at night, even when I shouldn't have to. I keep having this weird dream. Same one. Each time, the best friend nodded. Each time, he told himself it was stress. After all, pressure changes people. Success complicates families. Everyone has dark thoughts now and then, right? But the dreams were different. They weren't abstract. They weren't symbolic. They were specific. Same setting. Same sequence. Same ending. The filmmaker described them once in detail, lowering his voice even though no one else was around. He talked about waking up with his heart racing, about checking the house before going back to bed, about the feeling that the dream didn't want to stay in the past. The best friend listened and felt something shift. Not panic, recognition. Because deep down, he knew this wasn't just imagination. But knowing something and accepting it are two very different things. So he chose the easier path. He reassured. He minimized. He joked. "You've been watching too many thrillers," he said. The filmmaker laughed. But the dreams kept coming. And here's where the story turns uncomfortable. Because at some point, fear stopped being hypothetical. There was an argument. Not explosive, not violent, but sharp. Words said that couldn't be taken back. Accusations that hit too close to home. The filmmaker mentioned it later, almost as an afterthought. "He looked at me differently that day," he said. "Like I wasn't family anymore." That was the moment the best friend felt the knot in his stomach tighten. Because now there was a face attached to the fear. A memory. A reason. Still, he said nothing. Why? Because speaking up would have meant choosing sides. And choosing sides would have meant admitting that something was broken beyond repair. So instead, he did what many people do when they're scared of the truth. He buried it. He focused on work, on appearances, on laughter. He convinced himself that as long as no one said it out loud, it couldn't be real. But fear doesn't disappear when you ignore it. It waits. And in this dramatized account, the final warning came quietly. No raised voice. No dramatic plea. Just a sentence that sounded like resignation. "If anything ever happens," the filmmaker said, "promise me you won't let them pretend they didn't see it coming." The best friend froze. Because suddenly, this wasn't about dreams anymore. It was about inevitability. He didn't respond right away. Then he did the worst thing possible. He promised. "I won't say anything," he said. "I swear." At the time, it felt like comfort. In hindsight, it felt like a mistake that would follow him forever. Because not long after that conversation, the calls slowed. The jokes stopped landing. And the silence grew louder. Until the night the phone rang. And everything he had ignored came rushing back at once. Because as he listened to the voice on the other end of the line, one thought screamed louder than all the others. He had been warned. More than once. And he had chosen not to listen. But what he realized next was even more terrifying. Because the dreams weren't the only warning. There was something else. Something he noticed too late. The thing he noticed too late wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices. No slammed doors. No threats that could be replayed later and pointed to as proof. That's what made it worse. Because the most unsettling signs are usually the quiet ones. The best friend would later say it was a pattern he didn't recognize at the time because it looked so ordinary. Too ordinary. The kind of thing you only connect in hindsight, when the ending forces you to rewind the tape and watch everything again with different eyes. Have you ever looked back at a moment in your life and thought, "How did I miss that?" That's where he was now. Replaying visits. Replaying conversations. Replaying expressions that didn't fit the words being spoken. The first thing was the timing. Visits that happened late. Too late to be casual. Too unplanned to be coincidence. The filmmaker mentioned them in passing. "He just shows up sometimes," he said once, shrugging. "Doesn't even call first." At the time, it sounded like family tension. Nothing more. But the way he said it stuck. There was no anger in his voice. Just unease. The second thing was the house. The filmmaker loved that house. Spoke about it with pride. Treated it like a sanctuary. Until he didn't. Suddenly, there were locks. Extra cameras. Lights that stayed on through the night. When the best friend joked about it, the filmmaker didn't laugh. "Just being careful," he said. Careful from what? That question never got asked. Because asking it would have meant hearing the answer. And the answer might have been something no one wanted to confront. The third thing was the shift. The filmmaker became quieter. Not withdrawn. Not depressed. Measured. Like someone choosing every word carefully, aware that anything he said might travel further than he intended. Have you ever noticed how people behave when they no longer feel safe speaking freely? They simplify. They deflect. They stop sharing. That's exactly what happened. The jokes turned into observations. The warmth turned into politeness. And the best friend told himself a comforting lie. It's just age. It's just stress. It's just a phase. But deep down, another thought kept trying to break through. What if it's fear? Fear doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like control. And that's when the dreams came back into the conversation one last time. Not casually this time. Not jokingly. They were sitting across from each other, and the filmmaker looked tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. "I don't think they're dreams anymore," he said. The room went quiet. "What do you mean?" the best friend asked. The filmmaker hesitated, then shook his head. "Forget it," he said. "I shouldn't have said that. But once something is said, it can't be unheard. "What do you see?" the best friend asked. The filmmaker stared at the floor. He didn't describe the dream. He described the feeling, the certainty. "The ending never changes," he said. "That's what scares me." And for the first time, the best friend felt genuine fear. Not for himself, for the man sitting across from him, for the family wrapped up in something none of them fully understood, for the possibility that this wasn't imagination at all. But still he did nothing. Why? Because fear makes people freeze. And freezing feels safer than choosing the wrong action. He told himself that confronting it would make it worse, that involving anyone else would escalate things. That silence was the lesser evil. Have you ever convinced yourself that doing nothing was the responsible choice? That's the lie he told himself over and over again. Until the night, everything stopped being theoretical. The call came late. Too late. His phone buzzed on the table, lighting up the room. He remembers staring at it for a second before answering, as if part of him already knew that whatever was on the other end would change everything. The voice was strained, controlled, official. Words like incident, residence, investigation. And then the sentence that erased every excuse he had ever made. "We found two people." Time slowed. The jokes, the dreams, the locks. Every ignored detail collided at once. He hung up the phone and sat there, unable to move. Because in that moment, the promise he made years earlier came back to him. "I won't say anything." And suddenly, it felt like a curse. Because now, silence wasn't neutral. It was heavy. It pressed down on him with every breath. And the worst part? The realization that something could have been said. Not to accuse, not to condemn, but to acknowledge the fear, to take it seriously, to ask harder questions. But instead, he chose comfort. He chose loyalty over responsibility. And now, the cost of that choice was unbearable. As the news spread, as speculation grew, as people searched for explanations, he stayed quiet. At first, because breaking the promise felt like betrayal, but keeping it felt worse. Because every headline, every theory, every whispered rumor carried the same underlying accusation. Someone should have seen this coming. And deep down, he knew the answer. Someone did. He just didn't act. That's when the guilt shifted into something else. Something sharper. Because the more he replayed the past, the more one detail refused to stay buried. A moment he had brushed off completely. A moment that now felt impossible to ignore. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a joke. It was a sentence. Spoken plainly, with no humor at all. And it happened just weeks before everything ended. A sentence so clear, so unsettling, that remembering it now made his hands shake. Because once you hear what that sentence was, the silence becomes impossible to justify. And the promise he made becomes the most dangerous lie of all. He tried not to remember the sentence. At first, it stayed buried beneath everything else. The shock, the disbelief, the endless noise of speculation that followed the news. But memory has a way of resurfacing when you least want it to, especially when guilt sharpens every detail. Have you ever noticed how the mind protects you? Until it doesn't? The sentence came back in fragments at first. A tone, a pause, the way the room felt colder afterward. They had been alone. No audience. No distractions. Just two old friends sitting across from each other, the way they had hundreds of times before. Only this time, the laughter never arrived. The filmmaker looked at him and said it calmly. Too calmly. "If something happens," he said, "it won't be random." The best friend remembered blinking, unsure he'd heard correctly. "What do you mean?" he asked. The filmmaker didn't raise his voice, didn't dramatize it, didn't soften it either. "I mean, it won't come from nowhere." That was it. No elaboration, no explanation, just certainty. At the time, the best friend forced a smile. "You're scaring yourself," he said. "You always do that when you're tired." The filmmaker nodded. "Maybe," he said, but his eyes didn't agree. That was the moment, the one that replayed endlessly now. Because that wasn't fear. That was conviction. And the difference matters. Fear asks questions. Conviction answers them. Why didn't he push harder? Why didn't he ask what he meant? or just his own sense of peace? That's when another memory surfaced, one that made his stomach drop. A conversation he had dismissed entirely at the time. The filmmaker had asked him something unexpected. "If you ever had to choose," he said, "would you tell the truth, or would you protect the story people want to believe?" The best friend had laughed. "That depends," he said. "What's the truth?" The filmmaker smiled faintly. "Exactly," he said. At the time, it felt philosophical. Now, it felt prophetic. Because that was the real choice he had been avoiding. Truth versus narrative. Reality versus comfort. And he was starting to understand that by staying silent, he had chosen a side without admitting it. He had chosen the story people wanted. The one where nothing could have been done. The one where no one saw it coming. The one where responsibility dissolved into tragedy. But what if that story wasn't true? What if acknowledging the warning signs didn't accuse anyone, but instead honored the person who had tried to speak? That's when the guilt transformed into resolve. Not dramatic resolve. Not cinematic resolve. Something quieter. He stopped asking himself what would happen if he spoke, and started asking what would happen if he didn't. The answer scared him more. Because silence wasn't neutral anymore. It was shaping the legacy. And the legacy was wrong. The next few days were filled with internal negotiations. He rehearsed versions of the truth. Not the whole thing. Just enough. He imagined saying it out loud. Imagined the reactions. Disbelief. Anger. Confusion. He imagined being blamed. For not acting sooner. For not saying something then. For saying something now. And yet, none of those fears felt as heavy as the one he hadn't fully faced yet. What if the truth made things worse? What if it didn't bring clarity? What if it only added pain? That's the question that stops most people from speaking. Because truth doesn't come with guarantees. But lies do. They guarantee stagnation. They guarantee repetition. And the filmmaker had always hated stagnation. That's what finally tipped the scale. He remembered something else the filmmaker used to say. "Stories don't end when you stop telling them," he'd said. "They end when you stop pretending." That line played on a loop now. And for the first time, the best friend saw the situation clearly. This wasn't about confession. It was about correction. About acknowledging that the signs existed. That fear existed. That the dreams existed. And that dismissing them had consequences. The next step terrified him. Because once you speak, you lose control of the narrative. The truth becomes public property. It gets questioned, dissected, misunderstood. And still, he knew he couldn't stay silent anymore. So he made a decision. Not to tell everything. Not yet. But to stop lying. The next time the question came. And he knew it would. He wouldn't say no. He wouldn't dramatize it. He wouldn't accuse. He would simply say, he was scared. Nothing more. Nothing less. But even that felt like crossing a line. Because once you say that, the story changes. And sure enough, the question came again. Different person. Different setting. Same curiosity. Did he ever say he felt unsafe? This time, the pause was longer. Noticeable. The room seemed to hold its breath. "Yes," he said. Just one word. But it landed like an earthquake. The person blinked. "Really?" He nodded. And in that moment, the promise officially broke. Not because he betrayed it, but because it had already betrayed the truth. The reaction wasn't explosive. It was subtle. Questions that followed later. Conversations whispered in corners. A shift in tone. And suddenly, silence was no longer an option. Because once the truth cracks the surface, it demands more space. And the best friend knew what was coming next. The moment he would have to decide how much of the truth to tell. Because the dreams were still hidden. The sentence was still buried. And the most unsettling detail of all, the one that tied everything together, had yet to be spoken. And once that detail comes out, there's no going back. Because it changes not just what people think happened, but how they judge everyone who knew. Once the first truth escaped, it didn't leave quietly. It lingered. In the air. In conversations that stopped when he entered the room. In the way people suddenly listened a little too closely when he spoke. Have you ever noticed how one honest sentence can change the temperature of everything around you? He was scared. For words. That was all it took. Because those words did something silence never could. They introduced intent. They suggested history. They implied that what happened wasn't random. And now, everyone wanted to know what kind of fear it was. The best friend felt it immediately. The shift. People didn't ask outright at first. They circled it. They asked about stress. About family dynamics. About pressure. But underneath every question was the same unspoken thought. Scared of what? And more importantly, scared of whom? That's where things became dangerous. Because fear, when named, demands context. And context leads to responsibility. He tried to slow it down, tried to keep the truth contained. But truth doesn't respect boundaries once it's been released. It expands. The next few days were a blur of careful phrasing and half-answers. He stuck to safe ground. Generalities. Emotional impressions. He felt uneasy. He was under a lot of pressure. He didn't always feel safe at home. Each sentence was true, and each sentence avoided the core. But avoidance has a shelf life. And his was running out. Because people started comparing notes. One person mentioned the locks. Another mentioned the cameras. Another recalled the tension in his voice during the final months. Individually, those details meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern. And patterns demand explanation. That's when the questions became sharper. More direct. Less forgiving. Did he ever tell you why? Did he say who he was afraid of? Did you think it was serious? The last question was the hardest. Because the honest answer wasn't simple. Did he think it was serious? Yes. And no. He thought it was serious enough to listen, not serious enough to act. That contradiction haunted him. Because now, in hindsight, the line between listening and doing nothing felt unforgivably thin. Have you ever realized that your inaction was actually a decision? That's what he was facing. Every time he chose silence, he chose an outcome. And now, the outcome was irreversible. The turning point came unexpectedly. Not from a confrontation. From a memory. He was alone, sorting through old messages he hadn't looked at in years. Not searching for anything in particular. Just trying to feel close to a time before everything broke. That's when he saw it. A message he had dismissed when it arrived. Short. Unremarkable. Easy to ignore. Can we talk? Tonight, if possible. He remembered seeing it late. Remembered telling himself it could wait. Remembered replying the next day with an apology and a joke. They never talked that night. And now, that message felt heavier than any confession. Because what if that was the night the filmmaker needed someone to take him seriously? What if that was the moment things could have shifted? Those questions don't have answers, but they leave scars. That's when he realized something else. The filmmaker hadn't just been afraid. He had been alone in that fear. Surrounded by people. Loved by many. But alone where it mattered most. And that realization changed the story again. Because now it wasn't just about what happened. It was about what failed to happen. Support. Intervention. Acknowledgement. And once you see it that way, silence stops looking neutral. It starts looking like abandonment. The next time he spoke publicly, he planned to stay vague. He told himself he wouldn't go further. He wouldn't mention dreams. He wouldn't mention names. He would speak about emotion, not specifics. But something happened he didn't expect. He was asked a simple question. Not aggressive. Not accusatory. Almost gentle. Did he ever ask you for help? The room went still. Because that question bypassed speculation entirely. It went straight to the heart of the matter. And suddenly, he wasn't thinking about promises or narratives or consequences. He was thinking about that unanswered message. About that late-night request to talk. About the way the filmmaker's voice had changed in the final months. Yes, he said quietly. That answer hit harder than anything he'd said so far. Because asking for help changes everything. It reframes fear as a signal. It reframes silence as neglect. And it reframes loyalty as something far more complicated than he'd ever admitted. The reactions were immediate. Some people nodded, as if something finally made sense. Others looked uncomfortable. Because now, the story demanded accountability. Not legal, moral, emotional. Who knew? Who noticed? Who looked away? And where did responsibility really lie? That's when he felt the weight of the final truth pressing against his chest. The one detail he had avoided entirely. The one thing that tied the fear, the dreams, and the sentence together. Because fear alone doesn't explain everything. But fear paired with certainty does. And the filmmaker had certainty. Not about what might happen, but about how it would happen. That's the detail he had never shared. The detail that, once spoken, would erase any illusion that this was vague anxiety or general unease. It was specific, personal, and terrifying. He had described it once. Not graphically, not emotionally, almost clinically, as if naming it precisely might take its power away. The best friend had listened, and then done nothing. Now, standing on the edge of full disclosure, he understood what was truly at stake. This wasn't about clearing his conscience. It was about honoring a truth that had been ignored too long. But speaking it would change how everyone remembered everything. It would challenge the version of events people had settled into. And it would force a reckoning that no one was prepared for, including him. Because once he said it out loud, there would be no room left for doubt, no space left for denial, and no way to pretend that the warning signs were anything less than clear. The question now wasn't whether he would tell it. It was when, and whether he could live with the consequences once he did. Because the moment that detail enters the story, it stops being about tragedy. It becomes about choice. And the next choice he makes will define not just the story, but his place in it. He always thought the hardest part would be saying it. He was wrong. The hardest part was deciding how to live once it was said, because the detail he'd been avoiding wasn't just another piece of the puzzle. It was the piece that made the rest of it impossible to dismiss. Up until now, people could still cling to uncertainty, stress, tension, vague fear. All of that allowed room for comfort. But this erased comfort entirely. Have you ever held back a truth not because it was unclear, but because it was too clear? That's where he was. He hadn't spoken it because once spoken, it would change how people judged everything that came before it. And it would change how they judged him. The memory returned slowly, like it knew rushing would break him. They were sitting close together, not facing each other, side by side, the way people do when they don't want a conversation to feel confrontational. The filmmaker's voice was calm, not emotional. That was the most unsettling part. I don't think it would be sudden, he said. The best friend remembered frowning. What do you mean, he asked. The filmmaker paused, choosing his words carefully. I think it would build, he said. Escalate. Like it has been. Escalate. That word stuck. Because escalation implies history, pattern, progression. This wasn't fear of a random moment. It was fear rooted in behavior that had already crossed lines. The best friend didn't interrupt, didn't joke, didn't deflect. For the first time, he listened fully. The filmmaker continued. It wouldn't be loud, he said. Not at first. That was when the best friend felt a chill run through him. Because now the conversation had crossed from anxiety into foresight. And foresight demands response. But instead of responding, he froze. He wanted to stop the conversation, wanted to pull it back into safe territory. But the filmmaker kept going. He knows how to keep things contained, he said. How to stay calm when it matters. The best friend swallowed. Contained. Calm. These weren't words you use for nightmares. These were words you use for plans. And still, he said nothing. Why? Because acknowledging what he was hearing would have meant accepting responsibility for what came next. And responsibility is heavier than fear. Have you ever realized in the middle of a conversation that you're being trusted with something you don't want to carry? That's what this was. The filmmaker wasn't venting. He was confiding, entrusting, warning. And the best friend failed him. Not with cruelty, with hesitation. He didn't say, we need to talk to someone. He didn't say, this isn't something to ignore. He didn't say, you shouldn't be alone with this. Instead, he said something vague, something safe, something useless. You're thinking too far ahead. The filmmaker looked at him for a long moment. Not angry, disappointed. That look haunted him now more than any words ever could. Because disappointment means expectation. And expectation means the filmmaker believed he would be understood, that he would be taken seriously, that he wouldn't be dismissed. That belief was wrong. And now, the cost of that mistake pressed down on him with every breath. As the days went on, the pressure to speak grew unbearable. People were no longer just curious. They were unsettled. Because pieces were coming together whether he wanted them to or not. Someone mentioned escalation. Someone else mentioned containment. Someone else mentioned how calm everything appeared on the surface. And suddenly, the narrative shifted. This wasn't chaos. It was control. That realization changed everything. Because chaos feels unavoidable. Control feels preventable. And that's the difference that keeps people awake at night. The best friend found himself avoiding questions again. But this time, it wasn't fear of betraying a promise. It was fear of confirming what everyone was beginning to suspect. That this wasn't just tragedy. It was ignored warning, ignored foresight, ignored responsibility. Have you ever been trapped by your own delay? Where every second you stay silent makes speaking later feel worse. That's exactly where he was. Because now, if he spoke, people would ask the obvious follow-up. Why didn't you say something sooner? And he didn't have a good answer. Not one that would satisfy anyone. not even himself. The moment of reckoning came when someone said something that stopped him cold. They must have been completely blindsided. The person said, blindsided. The word felt wrong. Wrong enough that he couldn't let it pass. No, he said. The room went quiet. He hadn't planned to say it. It just came out. No, he repeated. It wasn't like that. Every eye turned toward him. And in that moment, he realized he had crossed a threshold. Because now, silence was no longer possible. Not without outright lying. What do you mean? Someone asked. He hesitated. This was it. The line between implication and confirmation. He chose his words carefully. He wasn't guessing, he said. He was observing. That sentence changed everything. Observing. Not imagining. Not fearing. Watching. Tracking. Understanding. And now, the room felt different. He could sense it. People weren't just listening anymore. They were recalibrating, rewriting their understanding of the entire story. Because observation implies time, pattern, repetition, and repetition implies missed opportunities. Someone asked the question he had been dreading. Did you believe him? The honest answer rose to his throat. Yes, he always had. He just didn't want to admit it. Yes, he said. And with that, the final barrier collapsed. Because believing someone and doing nothing is a far heavier burden than not believing them at all. The reactions weren't explosive. They were quiet. Which was worse? People looked at the floor, at their hands, at nothing. Because now, the tragedy had context. And context demands accountability. Not just from him. From everyone. From systems. From relationships. From the way discomfort is often mistaken for overreaction. From the way loyalty is sometimes used to excuse silence. He left that conversation shaken. Not because of what he said, but because of what he still hadn't. The most unsettling part was still missing. The reason the filmmaker was so certain. The detail that made his fear more than emotional. More than relational. There had been an incident. Small. Easy to dismiss. But impossible to forget once you saw it for what it was. The filmmaker had mentioned it once. Only once. And the best friend had dismissed it instantly. Because acknowledging it would have meant admitting that the line had already been crossed. Not metaphorically, but practically. Now, that memory refused to stay buried. It pushed forward, demanding recognition. And the best friend knew something terrible. The moment he shared that incident, there would be no room left for denial. No place left to hide behind ambiguity. And no way to avoid the question that would follow. Why didn't anyone intervene? That's the cliff he was standing on now. And the next step wasn't about courage. It was about consequence. Because once that incident enters the story, it stops being about fear or dreams or interpretation. It becomes about action, and inaction, and the cost of both. The only question left was whether he was ready to let the full truth out. Knowing it would change how everyone saw the past forever, and knowing it might change how they saw him even more. The incident sounded small when he first heard it. That was the problem. Small things are easy to dismiss, easy to rationalize, easy to explain away as misunderstandings, overreactions, or isolated moments that don't mean anything on their own. But small things are also how patterns begin. Have you ever noticed how the most important warning signs are rarely dramatic? They don't announce themselves. They don't demand attention. They sit quietly, waiting for someone to take them seriously. The filmmaker mentioned it almost reluctantly, as if saying it out loud might make it real. They were talking about something else entirely. A project, a scheduling issue, one of those conversations that drifts until it accidentally stumbles into something personal. He lost his temper the other night, the filmmaker said. The best friend barely looked up. Families argue. Stress flares. Tempers rise. None of that was unusual. Nothing serious, the filmmaker added quickly. Just different. Different how? That was the question the best friend didn't ask. Because asking it would have meant pausing the conversation and turning towards something uncomfortable. Instead, he nodded. Everyone snaps sometimes, he said. The filmmaker hesitated. Just discomfort. And discomfort is easy to ignore when it doesn't demand explanation. The filmmaker brushed it off after that. Changed the subject. Smiled. As if mentioning it had already gone too far. And the best friend followed his lead. Because that's what people do when they want things to stay normal. They pretend the abnormal is temporary. They tell themselves it won't happen again. They convince themselves that one incident doesn't define a person. But the filmmaker didn't forget it. And neither did his body. That became clear later. He started positioning himself differently in rooms, sitting closer to exits, standing when conversations got tense, keeping doors open that he used to close. These weren't conscious decisions. They were instincts, the kind you develop when your sense of safety shifts. The best friend noticed. He just didn't connect it, because connecting it would have meant accepting something he wasn't ready to accept, that the line had already been crossed. Not violently, not criminally, but psychologically. And psychological boundaries matter just as much. The filmmaker tried to explain it once more. Not directly, through analogy. You know how animals change when they realize someone else controls the space? He asked. The best friend laughed awkwardly. That's a strange way to put it, he said. The filmmaker shrugged. Space matters, he said. Who controls it matters. That sentence stayed with him longer than he expected. Because control of space is control of people. And control is rarely accidental. Looking back now, the best friend realized how many times the filmmaker tried to communicate without saying the thing outright. Because saying it outright would have forced a response. And he wasn't sure he would get one. That realization hurt more than anything else. Because it meant the filmmaker already knew that pushing harder might still lead to silence. And that knowledge changed the power dynamic completely. The best friend replayed that conversation endlessly now. Not because of what was said, but because of what it implied. The filmmaker wasn't asking for reassurance. He was testing whether his fear would be acknowledged. It wasn't. And after that, he stopped trying. The incident was never mentioned again. But its effects were everywhere. The increased security. The shortened visits. The way conversations ended abruptly when certain topics came up. These weren't coincidences. They were adjustments. And adjustments are responses to threat. Have you ever realized too late that someone stopped asking for help because you didn't listen the first time? That's the moment the best friend finally understood he had failed. Not because he didn't believe, but because he didn't prioritize. He let normalcy take precedence over concern. He let comfort outweigh responsibility. And now, the cost of that choice felt unbearable. As the truth continued to surface, the pressure intensified. People weren't just questioning events anymore. They were questioning judgment. And judgment cuts deeper than speculation, because it implicates everyone who stood nearby. The best friend felt it in every conversation now. The pauses, the careful phrasing, the unspoken expectation that he explain himself. But how do you explain hesitation? How do you justify silence when the signs were there? You can't. You can only acknowledge it. And acknowledgement was coming whether he wanted it to or not. Because someone else remembered the incident. Not in detail, but enough. A passing comment, a vague concern, a moment of unease that suddenly felt relevant. And once more than one person remembers something, it stops being a private doubt. It becomes a shared question. That's when the story crossed another threshold. Because now, the truth wasn't just coming from him. It was emerging collectively, piece by piece. And that terrified him. Because collective truth is harder to control. It doesn't stay neat. It doesn't stay kind. It demands accountability from everyone involved. The best friend realized then that the confession he feared wasn't a single moment. It was a process, one that had already begun, and the final step was still ahead. The step where he would have to say, out loud, what the incident meant. Not just describe it, interpret it, acknowledge that it wasn't nothing, that it wasn't harmless, that it wasn't just tension. It was a boundary crossed. And boundaries, once crossed, tend to be crossed again. That's what haunted him most. Not what happened, but what it suggested about what could happen, and what might have been prevented. Because once you accept that a line was crossed, the question becomes unavoidable. Why wasn't there intervention? Why wasn't there distance? Why wasn't there action? Those questions don't have comfortable answers. And he knew that once he spoke the truth of the incident plainly, those questions would turn toward him. Because he knew. And knowing without acting is its own kind of guilt. The night before he decided to speak fully, he barely slept. Not because of fear of backlash, but because of fear of clarity. Because once you see something clearly, you can never unsee it. And clarity was finally settling in. This wasn't about hindsight. It was about foresight that went unused. And the weight of that realization pressed down on him with crushing force. He understood now why the filmmaker had sounded so certain. Why the dreams were specific. Why the fear wasn't abstract. It wasn't intuition. It was experience. Experience that had been minimized, dismissed, ignored. And now, The truth was demanding to be named honestly, not as speculation, not as anxiety, but as a warning that went unheeded. The next time he spoke, he wouldn't be able to soften it. He wouldn't be able to frame it gently, because the incident stripped away ambiguity. And what remained was responsibility. Responsibility he could no longer outrun. Because the moment he names that incident for what it was, the story changes permanently. It stops being about tragedy. It becomes about failure. And the next chapter forces him to confront that failure head-on. Because once the full truth is spoken, there's only one question left. Who will accept responsibility, and who will pretend they still didn't see it coming? Failure is a word people avoid until it's unavoidable. Up until now, the best friend had been able to frame everything as misunderstanding, as hesitation, as tragic timing, words that softened the edges of responsibility and made it easier to breathe. But once the incident was named for what it was, none of those words fit anymore. Because misunderstanding implies confusion. Hesitation implies uncertainty. What he was facing now was neither. It was recognition without response. And that's what failure actually looks like. Have you ever realized that the moment you truly understand something is the same moment you lose the ability to excuse yourself? That's where he was. Because the more he replayed the incident, the clearer it became that it hadn't just been uncomfortable. It had been instructive. It had told him something about power, about control, about boundaries that were no longer respected. And he had seen it, acknowledged it, then chosen not to act. Not because he didn't believe it mattered, but because acting would have disrupted the fragile balance everyone was pretending still existed. He started to understand something deeply unsettling. The filmmaker wasn't wrong about certainty. He wasn't predicting the future. He was extrapolating from the present, from behavior that had already revealed itself. And once that clicked, the dreams made sense, not as premonitions, but as the mind trying to process a reality the waking world kept denying. Fear doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from pattern recognition. The best friend had always prided himself on being perceptive, on reading rooms, on understanding people. Now, that self-image cracked, because perception without action is meaningless, and in some cases, harmful. That's when the questions shifted again, not from others, from himself. Why did I stay quiet? And beneath that question, another one waited. What would I do if I could go back? That question hurt the most, because the answer was obvious. He would have spoken sooner. He would have pushed harder. He would have refused to accept vague reassurances. He would have insisted on distance, on mediation, on anything that acknowledged the seriousness of what he was being told. But regret doesn't change outcomes. It only clarifies responsibility. And responsibility was now unavoidable. The next time he spoke, he stopped trying to control the narrative. He didn't frame things delicately. He didn't soften language. He didn't hide behind ambiguity. He said something simple, something devastating. There were warning signs, he said, and we didn't respond to them. The reaction was immediate. Not outrage. Silence. Because silence is what happens when people recognize themselves in the story. Because if warning signs existed, then the question wasn't just why he stayed quiet. It was why others did too. Why discomfort was tolerated. Why fear was dismissed. Why preserving appearances mattered more than addressing reality. That's the moment the story stopped being about one person. It became systemic. It became cultural. It became about how often people choose peace over prevention, and how that choice can cost more than anyone expects. The best friend felt exposed, not because people were blaming him, but because they were relating to him, because everyone had a version of this in their own lives. A moment they noticed something was wrong and told themselves it wasn't their place. A concern they dismissed because addressing it felt inconvenient. A warning they minimized because acknowledging it would have required action. That shared recognition made the room heavy. Because once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. And the filmmaker had seen it too, long before anyone else was ready to. That realization reframed everything. The fear, the dreams, the certainty. They weren't expressions of weakness. They were expressions of clarity. Clarity that went unsupported. And unsupported clarity turns into isolation. Isolation turns into resignation. And resignation is where hope goes to die quietly. The best friend began to understand that the filmmaker hadn't been waiting for rescue. He had been waiting for validation. For someone to say, "You're not imagining this." For someone to treat his concern as legitimate. That never happened. And once he understood that, the guilt shifted again. It became grief. Grief not just for what was lost, but for what was never given. Support, acknowledgement, action. The more he spoke, the more the story evolved. Not in sensational ways, in sobering ones. People stopped asking what happened. They started asking why nothing changed when the signs appeared. That's a harder conversation, because it implicates relationships, not events. Choices, not accidents. And the best friend felt the weight of that shift pressing down on him. Because he was no longer just a witness. He was an example of what happens when good intentions replace decisive action, of how loyalty can become paralysis, of how silence can masquerade as kindness. He didn't try to defend himself. There was no defense that would satisfy him anyway. Instead, he did something he hadn't done before. He accepted responsibility. Not legal, moral. He said it plainly. I should have taken it seriously sooner. That sentence changed how people looked at him. Not with judgment, with gravity. Because accountability is disarming. It removes the need for speculation. And once accountability enters the room, everything else follows. Hard questions. Uncomfortable truths. Unanswered what-ifs. The hardest part wasn't admitting failure. It was realizing how preventable some things might have been. Not guaranteed, not certain, but possible. And possibility is cruel in hindsight, because it offers no resolution, only contrast between what was and what could have been. The best friend found himself thinking about that unanswered message again. Can we talk? Tonight, if possible. It haunted him, not because it proved anything conclusively, but because it represented a fork in the road, a moment where intervention might have changed the trajectory, or at least acknowledged the fear. That's the thing about responsibility. It doesn't require certainty. It requires care, and care had been insufficient. As the days passed, the conversation widened. People began reflecting on their own roles, their own hesitations, their own moments of silence. And in that way, the truth did something unexpected. It didn't just assign blame. It created awareness. Awareness that patterns like this don't exist in isolation. They exist everywhere. In families, in workplaces, in friendships. Anywhere discomfort is easier to ignore than confront. The best friend understood now why the filmmaker had seemed so resigned near the end. Because resignation is what happens when repeated attempts to be heard fail. When concern is met with minimization. When fear is met with reassurance instead of response. And that understanding broke something open inside him. He stopped thinking about confession as exposure. He started thinking about it as obligation. Because telling the truth wasn't about absolving himself. It was about honoring the experience of someone whose voice had been softened into irrelevance. That shift mattered. Because now, the truth wasn't about events. It was about meaning. About what those events represented. About the cost of silence. But there was still one piece missing. One final element that reframed everything once again. Because throughout all of this, the focus had been on what the filmmaker feared. What he predicted. What he experienced. But there was another side to the story. One the best friend had avoided entirely. The part about how others responded when concern was raised indirectly. The subtle discouragement. The quiet pressure to let things go. The unspoken expectation that rocking the boat would only make things worse. Those dynamics mattered too. Because silence doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's reinforced, encouraged, rewarded. And once the best friend acknowledged that, he realized something unsettling. He hadn't just failed individually. He had participated in a system that discouraged action. A system that prized harmony over honesty. That realization forced a new question into the open. Not who failed, but how many people had been conditioned to, and what that conditioning costs. Because if this story ends with individual guilt alone, nothing changes. But if it exposes a pattern, something might. That thought stayed with him. Because now, the truth was bigger than any one person. It was about recognizing the difference between peace and avoidance, between loyalty and responsibility, between silence and safety. And the final piece of the story would bring that distinction into sharp focus. Because there was one last conversation, one that happened after the incident. After the dreams intensified, after the fear became certainty, a conversation the best friend hadn't mentioned at all, because at the time, it seemed insignificant. But now it felt decisive. It was the moment the filmmaker stopped asking to be heard and started preparing to be remembered. What was said in that conversation changes everything. Because it reveals that the warning wasn't just given. It was concluded. And once you hear what that conclusion sounded like, you'll understand why this story doesn't end with confession, but with reckoning. The last conversation didn't feel important at the time. That's the cruel irony of it. It didn't arrive with urgency. It didn't sound like a warning. It didn't demand immediate attention. It slipped in quietly, disguised as reflection. Have you ever had a moment that only reveals its weight after it's already passed? That's what this was. They were alone again. Not by design, just circumstance. The kind of quiet space that happens when schedules finally loosen and no one is rushing anywhere. The filmmaker seemed calmer than he had in months. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it felt unsettling. Because calm, after prolonged fear, doesn't always mean relief. Sometimes it means resolution. The best friend noticed it immediately. "You seem better," he said. The filmmaker smiled. "Clearer," he replied. That word again. Clear. It had followed him for weeks. Clarity without action. Clarity without response. The best friend nodded, relieved. "Good," he said. "That's good." But the filmmaker didn't share his relief. "Clarity changes things," he said. "It makes you stop waiting." Waiting for what? That question never got asked. Because again, the moment passed too easily. They talked about work, about the past, about people they used to know. Normal conversation. Safe conversation. Until the filmmaker said something that didn't fit. "If people tell the story later," he said, "they'll miss the quiet parts." The best friend frowned. "What do you mean?" The filmmaker leaned back. "They'll focus on the ending," he said. "They always do." There it was again. The ending. This wasn't the first time he'd referenced it. But this time, it wasn't fear talking. It was acceptance. The best friend felt a subtle tightening in his chest. "You're talking like it's already written," he said lightly. The filmmaker looked at him. Not sharply, not emotionally, just honestly. "Some things are," he said. That should have stopped the conversation cold. It didn't. Because when people speak with certainty, others often assume they're exaggerating, or philosophizing, or being dramatic. We rarely assume they're stating fact. And that assumption cost more than anyone realized. The filmmaker continued. "I used to think someone would intervene," he said. "That it would reach a point where it couldn't be ignored." The best friend stayed quiet. "I don't think that anymore," the filmmaker said. The silence stretched. "What changed?" the best friend asked. The filmmaker considered the question. "Nothing," he said. "That's the point. Nothing changed. No intervention. No acknowledgement. No response. Just time passing. And time, without action, doesn't heal fear. It hardens it." The filmmaker spoke again, softer now. "I've adjusted," he said. Adjusted. That word landed heavier than anything else he'd said. Adjusted how? The best friend didn't ask. And that was the final failure. Because adjustment, in this context, didn't mean healing. It meant adaptation, preparation, acceptance of a reality that others refused to name. The filmmaker stood up, straightened his jacket, smiled. "I should go," he said. The best friend stood too. They hugged briefly. A normal goodbye. The kind that happens 1,000 times. Except this one wasn't normal. Because the filmmaker paused just before leaving, looked at him, and said something the best friend wouldn't understand until much later. "People will ask if I tried to say something," he said. "You can tell them I did." The best friend laughed nervously. "Of course you did," he said. "You always do." The filmmaker didn't smile. "That's not what I mean," he said. And then he left. That was it. No dramatic farewell. No final plea. Just a sentence that sounded like closure. Just discomfort. And discomfort is easy to ignore when it doesn't demand explanation. The filmmaker brushed it off after that. Changed the subject. Smiled. As if mentioning it had already gone too far. And the best friend followed his lead. Because that's what people do when they want things to stay normal. They pretend the abnormal is temporary. They tell themselves it won't happen again. They convince themselves that one incident doesn't define a person. But the filmmaker didn't forget it. And neither did his body. That became clear later. He started positioning himself differently in rooms. Sitting closer to exits. Standing when conversations got tense. Keeping doors open that he used to close. These weren't conscious decisions. They were instincts. The kind you develop when your sense of safety shifts. The best friend noticed. He just didn't connect it. Because connecting it would have meant accepting something he wasn't ready to accept. That the line had already been crossed. Not violently. Not criminally. But psychologically. And psychological boundaries matter just as much. The filmmaker tried to explain it once more. Not directly. Through analogy. You know how animals change when they realize someone else controls the space? He asked. The best friend laughed awkwardly. That's a strange way to put it, he said. The filmmaker shrugged. Space matters, he said. Who controls it matters. That sentence stayed with him longer than he expected. Because control of space is control of people. And control is rarely accidental. Looking back now, the best friend realized how many times the filmmaker tried to communicate without saying the thing outright. Because saying it outright would have forced a response. And he wasn't sure he would get one. That realization hurt more than anything else. Because it meant the filmmaker already knew. Knew that pushing harder might still lead to silence. And that knowledge changed the power dynamic completely. The best friend replayed that conversation endlessly now. Not because of what was said, but because of what it implied. The filmmaker wasn't asking for reassurance. He was testing whether his fear would be acknowledged. It wasn't. And after that, he stopped trying. The incident was never mentioned again. But its effects were everywhere. The increased security. The shortened